The solicitor read the will by candlelight because the electricity in Morn Hall had not worked in 11 years, and no one, not the caretaker, not the county electrician, not the firm of Hartwell and Sons who managed the estate, had ever been able to say why. Cordelia Voss sat with her hands folded in her lap and listened to the man read her great-aunt's final wishes with the flat, practiced calm of someone delivering a grocery list. The hall was hers, every acre of its dying grounds, every room with its velvet gone gray and its portraits gone strange, every cellar whose doors the caretaker refused to open after dark, hers, along with a debt she had not known existed and a condition she did not understand. The heir must reside at Morn Hall for no fewer than 30 consecutive nights. She must not leave the grounds between dusk and dawn. Cordelia read the clause twice, then a third time. "That's unusual," she said. The solicitor did not look up. Your great-aunt was an unusual woman. She had never met the woman. Her mother had spoken of her rarely and with a careful blankness that Cordelia had learned over the years to recognize as deliberate silence. There was a great deal her mother had chosen not to say, and most of it seemed to live in this house, in these rooms, in the smell of cold stone and something older beneath it, something mineral and dark, like iron left too long in standing water. She moved in on the 1st of October. The hall was larger than she had expected, and quieter in a way that felt structural, as though the silence were load-bearing. The caretaker, an elderly man named Pell who communicated primarily through eyebrow movements, showed her to the East Wing bedroom, pointed out which floorboards would hold her weight and which would not, and left before she could ask him anything useful. That first night Cordelia did not sleep. She lay in the canopy bed and listened to the hall breathe around her, the creak and settle of old wood, the sound of wind finding gaps in the casements, and something else, a low, intermittent resonance she could not place. Not a sound exactly, more like a pressure, like the feeling before a storm, held permanently in the walls. She told herself it was the house settling. On the third night she found the portrait. It hung at the end of the long gallery on the 2nd floor, half hidden behind a curtain that had been drawn across it with deliberate care, as though someone had not wanted it looked at. Cordelia drew the curtain back out of simple curiosity, holding her candle up. The man in the portrait was painted in oils gone dark with age, but the image was still precise. He stood against a background of storm and stone, dressed in the manner of 2 centuries past, one hand resting on the hilt of a sword he had not drawn. His face was angular and pale, the expression on it impossible to name, something between grief and absolute control, as though he had long ago decided that feeling things was a luxury he could no longer afford. His eyes, rendered in some pigment she did not recognize, seemed almost to catch the light. Cordelia stood there for a long moment, candlelight moving over the canvas. Then she heard it, not a sound but an arrival. A change in the quality of the air behind her, as though the room had taken a breath and held it. She turned. He stood at the far end of the gallery. He was precisely as tall as the portrait, and his face was precisely as pale, and the expression he wore was precisely the same, that careful, terrible containment. He was dressed in dark wool, nothing archaic about the cut of it, but there was nothing modern about him either. He existed in the room the way old things exist, with absolute certainty, unmoved by anything as temporary as the present moment. He was looking at her with an expression she could not read, and then, she would think about this later, would try to reconstruct the exact sequence of it. Something crossed his face that she had not expected, something that broke through the containment briefly, like a crack in stone. He went very still, stiller than anyone she had ever seen stand. Stiller than sleep. His eyes moved over her once slowly, and whatever he was doing with his senses, it was not simply looking. She felt observed in a way that went past sight, past the surface of her, as though he were reading something written beneath her skin. "You," he said. One word, quiet as snow. "I'm sorry," Cordelia said, because she could not think of anything else. "I didn't know anyone else was in the house." He did not respond for a long moment. The candle flame between them barely moved. "That is my blood," he said. He was not speaking to her, she realized. He was speaking to himself in the manner of a man confronting something impossible. In your veins, after 200 years, his voice dropped to something nearly inaudible. How is that possible? Cordelia's grip tightened on the candlestick. I think, she said carefully, that you should explain who you are. His gaze returned to her face. He studied her as though she were a text in a language he had believed extinct. My name is Valyrian, he said. I built this house. I have slept beneath it for 2 centuries. A pause. Something shifted in his eyes, that grief she had seen in the portrait surfacing. And you carry the blood of my line, which ended the night the woman I loved died in this very hall. The candle between them guttered. Neither of them moved. She did not run. Cordelia considered this later with a detached sort of wonder, that her first instinct upon being told she carried the blood of an ancient vampire's dead lineage had not been to flee the gallery, but to stand very still and attempt to think clearly. She supposed her mother would have called this her most useful quality. Her mother had also called it bloodless pragmatism, and had not meant it as a compliment. But Cordelia had never been sure why. You should sit down, Valyrian said. I don't need to sit down. No. But I find that humans often do in this moment. This moment. As though he had delivered this particular revelation before. She filed the thought away. What do you mean my blood is yours? She asked. Her voice was steady. She was grateful for that. He moved to the window at the far end of the gallery. Not quickly, not with any of the theatrical swiftness she might have imagined. Simply walked, the way a man walks through a room he has known for 2 centuries. He stood with his back partly to her, looking out at the grounds where the October fog had come in thick and low. 207 years ago, he said. I had a ward. A girl named Elowen Voss, who was the daughter of a man I had taken under my protection. He paused. She was mortal. I did not intend for what passed between us to happen. Such things in our law are forbidden. Cordelia held the candle steadier. Voss, her name. Her mother's name. Her mother's name. Her great-aunt's name. She died, he continued. The words came out of him carefully, like things he had learned to carry without letting them cut, before I understood what I had done, what blood exchange between our kinds can do to a mortal lineage. She died of a fever, ordinary and swift, as mortals die, and I believe the line ended with her. It didn't. No. He turned slightly. In profile, with the fog-gray window behind him, he looked exactly like the portrait. She had been with child. No one told me. By the time I learned, it was too late to find what had become of the infant. And He stopped. I went into the earth. There was nothing left that required me to remain above it. The gallery was very quiet around them. You came back, Cordelia said, tonight. Something woke me. His voice changed fractionally, became less controlled, more careful, which she was beginning to understand meant the same thing for him. A scent, your scent, moving through the upper rooms. It is unmistakable. It is... He turned fully to face her now. His eyes in the candlelight were a color she could not name. It is like smelling my own blood outside of my own body. I could not have remained below. Cordelia looked at him for a long moment. My great-aunt left this house to me, she said finally, with conditions. I'm required to stay for 30 nights. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, she thought. Recognition. She knew, Cordelia said. Didn't she? She must have. He was quiet. The women of your line have known for generations that this house holds a debt. Your great-aunt appears to have decided the debt should finally be paid. What debt? He did not answer immediately. He looked at her with that quality of absolute stillness, and she had the sense of being weighed, not cruelly, not predatorily, but with a precision that left no room for flattery or pretense. I owe your bloodline everything, he said at last. The continuation of what I believed lost, the survival of something I had given up. The words cost him something, She could see it in the careful way he held himself, as though the sentence required structural support. And your bloodline carries something of mine, a dormant inheritance, a memory that lives in the blood. What kind of memory? The kind that takes time to explain. He moved toward the door at the far end of the gallery. Away from her, she noted, not toward her. You should sleep. It is past 2 a.m, and I have already given you more than is prudent for one night. You're leaving? He paused without turning. I am not leaving. I am simply not standing in your gallery at 3 a.m. while you decide whether you are afraid of me. I haven't decided yet. I know. Something in his voice shifted, very slightly. That is, I find, the most unsettling thing about you. He was gone before she could respond, not with any theatrical vanishing, simply through the door and into the dark corridor beyond, leaving her alone with the portrait and the fog and the low, persistent pressure in the walls that she now understood had a source. Cordelia stood in the gallery for a long time after he left. Then she went to the mirror at the gallery's far end, an old silvered thing, spotted with age, and looked at her own face. Ordinary face. Dark hair, pale skin, the slight hollowness under her eyes that came from not sleeping well. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that should have the capacity to wake something ancient from the earth. And yet, she lifted her hand and pressed 2 fingers to the inside of her wrist, where her pulse moved steady and quiet. Her blood. His blood. Something inherited and unbroken over 2 centuries of women who had apparently known what they carried and said nothing. Her mother's careful silences took on a new and complicated shape. She went back to her room. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the house breathe, and this time she could almost hear, beneath it, something that sounded like a heartbeat. Very slow, very old, no longer underground. He was in the library when she came down in the morning. She had half expected him not to be there at all. Had half expected to wake and find the hall return to its ordinary silence, the portrait rehanging in its usual removed way, the encounter reduced to something that could be attributed to a strange house and poor sleep. But he was seated at the long table by the library window with a book open before him, and the morning light came gray and cold through the glass and cast no shadow from him at all. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. You cast no shadow, she said. No. He returned his gaze to the book. We do not. She came in and sat across from him, which seemed to require no particular acknowledgement from either of them. There was a quality to his presence that made formality feel unnecessary. He was simply there, as the walls were there, as the cold was there. And one adjusted. I want to know everything, she said. He turned a page. That will take considerably longer than 30 nights. Then start with the most important things. He closed the book. He did so without any visible irritation, which she noted. He treated her requests with a seriousness she had not expected, as though her desire to understand were a reasonable and even appropriate thing, rather than an inconvenience to be managed. Eloin Voss, he said, your ancestor. She was 17 when her father brought her here. She was... He paused. Something in his face shifted in the way she was learning to watch for, small movements, nearly invisible, that represented the only outward record of what he was feeling, remarkable, not in any dramatic sense. In the sense of being a person one cannot easily dismiss or forget, a quality of presence. Cordelia waited. I was not careless, he said quietly. I want you to understand that. What passed between Eloin and me was not... It was not the act of a man who did not know better. I knew better. I knew the law. He looked at his hands resting flat on the table. I chose differently, and then she was gone. And I had not understood the consequence. And the consequence was that somewhere in the world a child was growing up carrying what I had given her mother. And he stopped again. I failed her. She might not have seen it that way. No, but I do. Outside the windows the grounds stretched away into fog. The great oaks stood barely visible, their forms dissolving at the edges, and beyond them, the stone wall that marked the limit of the hall's land. Cordelia looked at all of it and tried to imagine 2 centuries of it. The same fog, The same trees growing slowly, the same stone wall while the world outside it changed and changed and changed. "What is the blood memory?" she asked. "You mentioned it last night." "A dormant inheritance." He regarded her for a moment. "Eloan carried my blood in her veins at the time of her death, not a full exchange. Enough only to create what we call a trace. In vampire lineages, a blood trace dies with the host. In mortal lineages," he tilted his head slightly, "it inherits. It passes through the women of the line, becoming more dormant with each generation, but never quite extinguishing." "And in me?" "In you," he said slowly, "it is not dormant." Cordelia felt the quality of the silence change between them. "Which means," she said, "which means you can hear things you should not be able to hear. Perhaps you have always been able to, without knowing the source. You may have memories that do not belong to you, images or feelings that surfaced in sleep, and seem to come from nowhere." He watched her face. Memories that feel old. She thought of the dreams she had carried since childhood. Stone corridors, candlelight. A man's hands, turning the pages of a book, a grief so old it had gone past feeling and become simply weather. A climate one lived inside without naming. She had always assumed they were her own imagination. "I see," she said. He said nothing. He simply watched her with that careful, precise attention, and she understood that he was giving her time to understand what she had been told. Not rushing toward the next thing, not managing her, simply waiting with 2 centuries of practice at waiting. "The condition in the will," she said. 30 nights. My great-aunt engineered this. It appears so. She wanted me to meet you." "She wanted you to understand what you are," he said. "Or what you carry. Whether they are the same thing remains to be established." Cordelia looked at him across the table. He looked back. The gray morning light lay between them, still and even. "What would you like from me?" she asked. "What do you actually want from this? From my being here?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I would like," he said at last, with a careful precision that suggested he was choosing every word with deliberate honesty, "to understand how she lived. Eloan. In the generations after her, I have slept for 2 centuries while her blood continued forward in time, and I know nothing of it." He looked down at his hands again. "I buried myself in grief, and called it rest, and the world continued without me. I would like, if you are willing, to know something of what I missed." Cordelia considered this for a moment. It was, she thought, possibly the most honest thing anyone had ever asked of her. "All right," she said, "I'll tell you what I know." He looked up. For just a moment, brief enough that she might have imagined it, something in his face that was not quite grief and not quite relief passed through and was gone. "Thank you," he said. On the 7th night, Cordelia cut her hand on the broken glass of a conservatory door. It was her own fault. She had been attempting to force the latch of the East Conservatory, locked for reasons that the caretaker Pell had conveyed primarily through eyebrow, and the old glass panel beside the frame had simply given way beneath her palm. The cut was not deep, but it was sharp and immediate, and she pulled her hand back and pressed it against her coat and stood for a moment calculating the damage. She was alone, or she believed herself alone. Valyrian came around the corner of the corridor from the direction of the library with the speed and silence of someone who had heard a sound no human ear should have been able to detect at that distance. He stopped when he saw her. His gaze went to her hand, pressed against her coat, and then he went very still. She had seen him go still before. This was different. The stillness was not the controlled, architectural kind. This was the stillness of something that had detected prey and was using everything in its possession to resist that fact. The muscles of his jaw were tight. His eyes had changed. The color she could never quite name had deepened, shifted. He did not move toward her. "I'm fine," she said. "It isn't serious." "I know." His voice was very careful. "I need you to press that firmly for a moment and go to the kitchen." Valyrian, Cordelia, her name in his mouth for the first time. She noted it even in the midst of the moment. Please, she went to the kitchen. He followed at a distance that she understood, now was deliberate. Not politeness, but necessity. She ran cold water over the cut at the sink, and when she looked up, he was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed somewhere above her head, making a study of the architecture. "You can come in," she said. "I'm quite comfortable where I am." She dried her hand. The cut was clean, not deep, already beginning to dull. She found a cloth in the drawer and bound it. "It doesn't frighten me," she said. "What you are." "It should. Perhaps. But it doesn't." He finally looked at her. His eyes were returning to their usual color. Slowly, the way water clears. He was not pleased with himself, she thought. There was something in the line of his mouth that belonged to a man exacting a private accounting. "The blood memory," he said after a moment. "Does it come more often now, since you arrived here?" She had been thinking about this for days. The dreams had shifted since her first night in the hall, become less vague, more specific. She had seen faces in sleep that she thought she ought to recognize. A woman with her own dark hair, standing at a window very like the one in the East Wing. A sense of waiting, pervasive and old. "Yes," she said, "more often and clearer. That will continue." He was quiet for a moment. "The longer you remain in this house, in proximity to me, the more active the trace becomes. Blood memory is not passive, it responds to presence." "Responds how?" He considered his answer. "You may begin to experience her memories directly. Not as dreams, as recollections. Things you did not witness but that will feel as though you did. It can be disorienting." "Whose memories? Eloin's?" "Hers. And mine, as they existed in her blood. The things she witnessed, the things she felt." He paused, and something of that grief she had first seen in the portrait moved through his expression. "Things I would not necessarily have chosen for you to see." Cordelia understood what he was telling her. She had the sudden, vertiginous sense of standing at the edge of something enormous. Not threatening, but vast. The way the sea is vast. And she had not realized until now how close to the edge she had been standing. "Were you happy?" she asked. "With her, before she died." The question surprised him. She could see that. The fractional widening of his eyes, the slight break in the controlled surface. "Yes," he said after a long moment. The word came out with the care of something kept preserved, handled rarely, for a short time. "Yes," Cordelia nodded. She looked down at her bound hand. "I need to ask you something," she said. "About the blood exchange between you and Eloin. Was it... did she..." "She was willing," he said, quietly but with absolute certainty. "She asked. I told her every consequence I understood and some I clearly did not. But she chose." "That matters," Cordelia said. "To me it has always mattered." The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside the fog had thinned, and the October dark was clear and hard, a few stars visible between the moving clouds. "I keep dreaming of a room," Cordelia said. "Stone, candlelight, a man's hands turning pages." She looked up at him. "That's this house, isn't it?" Those are her memories. His expression changed in a way she was beginning to recognize as significant, precisely because it was so small. A softening around the eyes, a particular quality of stillness that was different from his usual kind. This one had something tender in it. "The library," he said. "Yes, that is the library." A pause. "She sat with me when I read." She said it was the quietest she had ever felt in that room. Cordelia said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not reduce the moment, and she had learned very quickly that Valyrian did not respond well to reduction. She went to bed an hour later with her hand bound and the blood memory pressing at the edges of sleep, and when she finally drifted, she was in the library, and she was not herself, and she was very quietly content. There were letters hidden in the portrait frame. Cordelia discovered this on the 11th night, when she went back to the gallery with a lamp, and the particular kind of restlessness that came from having slept too much by day and not at all by night. The portrait had been occupying some portion of her attention since she had first drawn back its curtain, and she found herself standing before it again with the lamp raised, studying the details she had not had the patience for on that first night. The frame was ornate, darkened gilt, carved with a pattern that she had taken for decorative vine work but which, on closer examination, resolved into a sequence. Not random. Deliberate, the carving moved in a direction, followed a logic, returned to a beginning. She ran her fingers along it and fell at the inner corner of the lower right section, a place where the wood moved. The compartment was small. Inside it, folded to near illegibility, were 6 letters. She carried them to the library. Valyrian was already there, as he generally was at this hour. He seemed to require very little in the way of sleep, which she supposed made a certain practical sense, and had established a habit of reading through the night in the same chair with the same lamp, as though the intervening 2 centuries had simply not happened. He looked up when she came in and placed the letters on the table. He was still for a long time. "You found them," he said at last. "You knew they were there. I put them there." He did not reach for them. "After she died. I did not know what else to do with them. Burying them felt wrong. Burning them." He stopped. "I could not. They're hers, mine, written to her, after. Letters she never received." Cordelia looked at the folded papers. She did not touch them. "You should read them," she said carefully. "Not me." He looked at her across the table with an expression she had not seen before, something stripped of the usual control, naked in the way that things are naked when they have been kept covered too long and the covering is finally removed. "I know what they say," he said. "I wrote them. I have spent 200 years knowing what they say." He looked away. "What I did not know was whether any part of her survived to come back to eventually. Whether there was any point in having written them at all." A pause. "Now I know that there was." "Is that why you needed me here?" Cordelia asked quietly. "Not just to understand what happened to her line. You needed to know she hadn't simply ended." He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. "Yes," he said finally. "I suppose that is the truer reason." She thought about what it meant to carry grief for 2 centuries, not the sharp, immediate kind, the kind that moved through years and became something else, something structural, a grief that had stopped being an emotion and become a fact of one's existence, like hunger or cold. She thought about lying beneath the earth with that grief while the world continued, while the line he had thought ended continued quietly forward, generation by generation, carrying something of him without knowing it. "She loved you," Cordelia said. It was not a guess. She had seen the library in the blood memories. She had felt what Eowyn had felt, sitting beside him in that room. The quality of attention she had given him, the particular texture of quietness that is only possible with a person one trusts entirely. One does not feel that way about someone without love. Whatever word had been used for it, 200 years ago, in this house. Valyrian's face did not change, but something behind it did. Something in the eyes, that deepening shift, and she understood that he had known this and had also needed, after 2 centuries, to hear it said aloud by someone who was not himself. "I know," he said. He said it the way one says things that have been carried a very long time. Cordelia looked at the letters on the table between them. "I'm going to read the letters Aunt left me, the ones from the solicitor's files. There were several she wrote over the years. The caretaker mentioned them." She paused. "I think she knew more than she put in the will. I think she's been managing this house toward tonight for a long time. Your great-aunt sounds formidable. I never met her." A pause. "But I'm beginning to think that was intentional, too." He considered this. "Why would she have kept you from this house?" "Because she wanted me to come to it as a stranger, without attachment or expectation, so that whatever happened here would be." She searched for the word. "Clean." Valyrian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She sounds like a woman who understood the long view. She was 93 when she died. I imagine 2 centuries of bloodline knowledge gives a person a fairly long view." Something moved across his face. Brief, unexpected. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the shape of what a smile might have been, in a man who had not had cause for one in a very long time. Cordelia gathered the letters and left them on the table between them and went to find the files the caretaker had left in the study, and the night moved on. He sat in the library after she had gone and did not read. This was itself unusual. He had spent 200 years reading or something like it, the slow, methodical passage through knowledge as a means of remaining present in the world, anchored to time by the movement of ink beneath his eyes. He had read the library empty twice, sent for new books, read those. He had treated time like water to be moved through, steadily, without drowning. He was not reading now. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table and attending to the extraordinary fact of Cordelia Voss. She was not what he had expected. He had not, precisely, expected anything had emerged from the earth with no thought beyond the source of what he had sent it, that impossible familiar thread moving through the upper rooms of the hall, his own blood outside of his own body for the first time in 2 centuries. He had not thought past that. He had certainly not thought, she will sit across from me and ask me whether I was happy. He had been asked many things over the centuries. He had not been asked that. The blood memory in her was not dormant in the way he had tried to prepare himself for. He could feel it when she was near, a resonance, like a note held on the far edge of hearing. He had told her it would become more active with time and proximity. And this was true, but what he had not told her was that it acted on him as well as on her. That when she was in a room with him, he could feel the echo of Elowen in her blood. Not Elowen herself, not her presence or her personality, but the trace of her, the shape of her absence, given weight by the carrier. It was, in a word, unbearable. Not violently. Not in the way that pain is unbearable. In the way that beauty is unbearable, when one has gone long enough without it. He had expected to feel grief when he surfaced. He had not expected to feel this, something more complicated, without a clean name, gratitude, perhaps, edged with something he had been scrupulously careful not to examine too closely. She was not Elowen. This required emphasizing internally. Because the blood made it confusing, she was her own person, contained, precise, direct in a way that Elowen had not been. She met him differently. She did not defer. She asked her questions and received his answers and considered them with a gravity that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the particular honesty of a person who has decided that the truth is worth more than comfort. He respected this. He was also, he acknowledged to himself in the empty library, becoming increasingly aware of her in ways that he had not been aware of another person in 200 years, and this was a problem of a specific and dangerous kind. The law was clear. It had been clear when he had bent it for Elowen, and the consequence of bending it had been her death and his centuries of penance. The trace in her blood was already a complication, a bond. A willing, deliberate bond would be something the council would not overlook. He was aware that the council had been aware of his emergence for a week. He had felt the watching begin 2 days after he surfaced, subtle as it was. They would not intervene immediately. They never did. They preferred to let matters develop to the point where intervention could be made with maximum inconvenience. He gathered the letters from the table, finally. His own handwriting looked back at him from the paper, unchanged, 2 centuries of it still legible. He had not read them since he had written them. He did not read them now. He held them, briefly, and then placed them back precisely where Cordelia had set them. She had not touched them. Had understood, without being told, that they were not hers to read. He thought about her saying, "She loved you." The complete absence of uncertainty in her voice, the matter-of-fact delivery of it as though she were telling him something that ought to have been obvious, something he should have known and didn't, and the only appropriate response was to simply say it plainly. He had known. Of course he had known. He had also needed, after 2 centuries, to hear it said by someone who was not himself. He had not expected her to understand that. He extinguished the lamp and sat for a time in the dark, listening to the house, and beneath it, steady, quiet, inescapably present, the sound of her heartbeat in the room above him. On the 14th night, she remembered Elowen's death. not in sleep, standing in the kitchen in the afternoon light, a cup of tea in her hand, and the memory arrived without warning. Complete, immediate, belonging to another body but entirely present in hers. She felt the fever, felt the ceiling of a room she had never been in, the particular texture of it, and then a face above her, and the grief in that face so absolute it had no floor. She set down the tea. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. When Valyrian came in at dusk, she said, "I remembered her death." He stopped moving. "I felt what she felt," Cordelia said. At the end, she looked at him. She was not afraid. She was sorry for you. That was the last thing. He turned away from her and stood at the window with his back to her for a long time, and she let him, and neither of them said anything else for an hour. They came on the 17th night, two of them, moving through the grounds as though the locked gate were an irrelevance. Cordelia saw them from the east wing window, figures in the fog, moving with a precision that was not human, along the path toward the hall's front door. She went to find Valyrian. He was already in the entrance hall. He was standing at the foot of the stairs with his hands at his sides and his face utterly composed, and she understood from the quality of his stillness that he had known they were coming and had chosen to receive them here rather than anywhere that mattered. "Go to the library," he said quietly. "Don't come out." "Who are they?" "Council arbiters." His voice was even. "They have authority over what occurs in this house. They will have questions about your presence here, your blood, specifically, and I need you not to be in the room when they ask them. What will they do if they find the trace in my blood active?" He was quiet for precisely 1 beat too long. "Go to the library, Cordelia." She went. But she left the library door open, and she stood beside it in the dark, and she listened. The two vampires who entered were not as old as Valyrian. She could hear that in some quality of how the air changed around them, a lesser version of what happened when he entered a room. Their voices were flat and official, carrying the cadence of people who had given official pronouncements for a very long time and had developed a permanent relationship with their own authority. "Lord Valyrian." A pause. "You have emerged. As you see, the woman. Who is she? A mortal, the inheritor of this estate. She carries a blood trace." The arbiter's voice shifted fractionally. "Your blood trace, active and responding. She is a direct descendant of Elowen Voss." Valyrian's voice was controlled, careful. "7th generation. The trace has survived through the female line and has become active in her proximity to this house. To me." A silence. "You understand the implications of this." "I understand them completely." "And yet you allowed her to remain. She is the legal heir to this property and has committed no offense. The trace in her blood is not her doing. She has done nothing to invite any consequence. The trace doesn't concern us." The arbiter's voice had a new quality now, something that Cordelia placed, after a moment, as deliberate. "What concerns us, Valyrian, is your intent. 2 centuries ago you broke covenant for a mortal. We granted leniency given the time you chose underground. We will not grant it again." A pause. "If you create a bond with this woman," the arbiter continued, "we will act. The consequences fall not only to you, a bonded mortal with active blood trace. She becomes a complication we cannot permit. You're threatening her. We are stating law." The silence that followed was very long. Cordelia stood in the dark of the library doorway with her hand pressed flat to the doorframe, listening to Valyrian say nothing, and understanding that his silence was a form of speech. "I have heard you," he said at last. "Good. Then we understand one another." The arbiters left. The front door closed. The quality of the air in the entrance hall changed, and she could hear Valyrian breathing, slow, controlled, the breath of a man who was reordering himself. She stepped out of the library. He turned. He looked at her face for a moment, and she thought she saw in the controlled surface of him a hairline fracture. "You heard all of it," he said. "Yes, I'm sorry, don't be." She came down the corridor. She stopped a few feet from him. "They threatened me, through you. It is how the council operates. Leverage against what one values." A pause. A slight pause. "It is effective. She absorbed this. What do you value, Valyrian, specifically? In this situation, he looked at her for a long time. She had the sense of being seen with the same precision as that first night in the gallery, all the way through her, past her surface, to whatever was written beneath. Your safety, he said carefully. Your ability to leave this house in 23 days unharmed and without consequence. And if I don't want to leave, the fractional change in his expression, the hairline fracture widening, just slightly. Cordelia. I'm not asking for a blood bond, she said with the flat pragmatism her mother had never approved of. I'm not asking for anything I don't understand. I'm asking what you want, not what is safe or permitted or strategically sound, what you want. He was quiet for so long that the silence became its own answer. Then he said, I want you not to be threatened by those men because of your proximity to me. That isn't what I asked. No. He looked away from her for a moment, then back. The control in his face was visible now as effort. She could see the cost of it, the deliberate architecture. What I want is something I do not have the right to, not at your expense. I think, Cordelia said carefully, that should be my decision. He said nothing, but something changed in the space between them, subtle and definitive, like a shift in season, not yet arrived, but clearly coming. Sleep, he said finally. We will talk tomorrow. She went, but at the foot of the stairs, she looked back at him where he still stood in the entrance hall, and there was something in his face, looking at her, that she did not think he knew she could see. She kept it to herself, and carried it up to bed like something fragile. On the 22nd night, she went to the library and found him standing before the fireplace holding one of the letters he had written to Elwyn. He was reading it. She could tell by the quality of his stillness that he had been standing there for some time. She almost left. Instead, she went in and sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the grounds, giving him the same quiet she had learned to give him in the mornings over the past 3 weeks. The particular respect of presence, without demand. He folded the letter eventually, placed it in his coat pocket. It is strange, he said, without turning, to read what I wrote at 27 and find that it is still true. You were 27 when you were turned? 29. He finally turned from the fire. In the firelight, he looked more human than he usually did. The warm light softened the angular precision of his face, made him look, briefly, like someone who might have a cold or a headache, ordinary complaints of ordinary flesh. I was 27 when I met Elwyn. And now you are 231, approximately. The corner of his mouth moved. After a point, one stops maintaining the count with precision. She smiled. It surprised her. It felt like a natural thing in this room, which it hadn't in the beginning. He crossed the library and sat in the chair across from her. He did not sit at the table with its professional distance. He sat as she sat beside the window, and the firelight reached them both. I need to tell you something, he said, about what is happening with the blood memory. The Arbiter's visit accelerated it. The stress response in your system appears to have... He stopped himself, started again with different words. I can feel when you are afraid, he said. Since the night the Arbiters came, it has become specific. She looked at him steadily. You can feel my emotions? Not precisely, intensities, states. He was uncomfortable with this, she could tell, not ashamed but genuinely troubled by it. It is not intentional. The trace in your blood is responding to the proximity and to the... He chose the word carefully. To the developing regard. Developing regard. She turned the phrase over. And can I feel yours? She asked. You have been, he said quietly, in the blood memories. The emotions in them are not only Elwyn's. She thought about the library memories, the qualities of grief in them, old, absolute, without bottom. She thought about the tenderness she had felt in the memory of Elwyn sitting beside him in this room, and understood now that she had not always been sure whose tenderness it was. This is what the council is afraid of, she said. Yes. Is it reversible? If I leave in 30 days, does it fade? He looked at her with complete honesty. Possibly. If there is no further proximity, the trace would likely return to dormancy. A pause. With time. And if I stay? He did not answer immediately. Valyrian. She leaned forward slightly. If I stayed, beyond the 30 days, not for a blood bond, simply stayed, lived here, what would happen? The trace would become permanent. You would carry it for the rest of your life. He held her gaze. And I would be able to feel when you were afraid, when you were in pain, when you were… He stopped. When I was happy, she finished. Yes. She sat back. The fire moved in its grate. Outside, the first real frost of the season had settled over the grounds, and the grass in the lamplight from the window was silver. Come here, she said. He looked at her. He did not move. Not, she shook her head. Not anything dramatic, just come here. He stood and moved across the room and settled on the window seat beside her. There was a foot of space between them. She was aware of the heat that did not come from him, the absence of warmth his body did not produce, and the impossible precision with which she was aware of him anyway, as though heat were not the metric she was using. She turned slightly so she could see his face. When I wake up in this house, she said, I'm not afraid, I'm not confused, I'm not looking for reasons to leave. She paused. I don't know if that's the trace or if it's just… She made a small, helpless gesture. I don't know how to separate those two things anymore. I'm not sure the distinction matters as much as I thought it would. He was very still beside her. What I do know, she continued, is that when the arbiters came and threatened consequences I don't fully understand, the thing I felt was not fear for myself. She looked at him directly. It was fear for you. His breathing changed. She heard it, a very slight alteration in the rhythm. He did not reach for her. He sat beside her with a foot of space between them and looked at her with an expression that contained everything he had not said across 3 weeks of careful, deliberate restraint. And she looked back, and neither of them moved, and the space between them had never felt so precisely the size of a decision. I need you to be certain, he said at last. Not because I require it, because you require it, because you are the kind of person who will only be at peace with the choice she has made with full understanding. I'm certain, she said, slowly, with a deliberateness that made it a clear and conscious act, not an impulse. He raised his hand and placed it over hers where it rested on the window seat between them. His skin was cold. She had known it would be. She held still beneath his hand and felt the weight of 2 centuries of waiting in that touch, and the frost on the grounds outside made the window glow, and the fire behind them held its light. The letters were her great aunt's, and they told the whole story. Cordelia spent the morning of the 25th day reading them in the study. 6 letters written over 40 years, addressed to no one and preserved with the careful intention of someone who knew exactly what she was preserving them for. The earliest one was written in the cramped hand of a young woman. The latest in the slow, deliberate script of age. You will come to Morn Hall, the final letter began, and he will be in the ground, and the house will be terrible and cold, and you will want very much to leave. Do not stay the 30 nights. They will not feel like 30 nights by the end. His name is Valyrian, and he loved Elowyn as well as any man has ever loved a woman of this family. Which is to say, completely and at great cost. The blood in your veins is his, and it is also hers, and it has been waiting for you for a very long time. I cannot tell you what to do with it. Every woman in our line has had to make her own accounting. What I can tell you is what I know, which is this. The things that are worth having are worth the price the world asks for them. The arbiters will come. Let them. The council's law is old and not without reason. But it is not the law that governs the human heart, and it is not the law that matters here. Be brave, my dear, not in the dramatic sense, in the quiet sense, in the way that matters. Cordelia set the letter down. She sat in the study with her hands in her lap and felt the blood memory in her. Present, awake, completely specific, and felt, underneath it, her own clarity. She found Valyrian in the garden. This surprised her. She had not seen him outside during daylight before. The October sky was close and gray, the light diffuse and without direct sun, and he stood among the dead roses at the east wall, with his coat dark against the pale stone. looking at the frost-killed garden with the expression she associated with him thinking about something old. He heard her coming, he always heard her coming, and turned. "My great-aunt's letters," she said. She held up the final one. She knew everything. I suspected as much. He did not move toward her or away. "What did she say?" "Everything that needed to be said." She looked at him across the garden. In the gray light, with the frost-bleached grass around him and the old stone wall behind him, he looked exactly like what he was, ancient and precise, and marked by time in ways that did not show on the surface. "I'm not leaving in 5 days. He was still. I'd spoken with Pell," she continued. "He has been managing this house for 40 years with the full knowledge of what it contained. He is, apparently, entirely unsurprised." She paused. "He also mentioned that the East Wing bedroom has better insulation, and if I intend to stay for winter, I should move my things." Something shifted in Valyrian's face. That almost not quite a smile. "He has known about me for 40 years, he said. His discretion has always been impeccable." She came through the garden toward him, carefully navigating the frost-stiffened rose canes. She stopped close enough that she could see the almost imperceptible movement of his breathing. That he breathed at all was, she had decided, something she found inexplicably reassuring. "I need to ask you something." "Yes, the blood trace becoming permanent, the connection becoming what you described." She looked at him steadily. "Is it what you want? Not what is safe, not what is permitted, not what is possible. What do you want?" He looked at her for a long time. "I want," he said carefully, "to not spend another 2 centuries in the earth." "That isn't—" "I know it isn't exactly an answer to the question you asked." He looked down at her. She was shorter than him, and the slight downward angle of his gaze gave his face a quality of nearness that made the space between them feel specific. "What I want is what I am trying to be very measured about wanting, because the last time I was not measured, the woman I loved died. I'm not going to die of a fever, Valyrian. You are going to die," he said quietly. "Eventually, as all mortals do, and you intend to spend the interval in the ground?" Silence. "No," he said. "No, I do not." She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment. Her hand, offered to him in the frost-killed garden, ordinary and serious. Then he took it, with the same careful deliberateness as the night before. His hand closed around hers, and she felt the cold of him, the absolute stillness of his pulse against her wrist, and the thing that lived underneath all of it. The weight of him, the reality of him, the particular way he existed in the world that was nothing like anyone else she had ever stood beside. "The Council will not simply accept this," he said. "I know. There will be consequences. I know that too." He looked at her hand in his. "You are the most pragmatic person I have met in 200 years. I prefer precise. That is also true." She squeezed his hand once. He did not let go. They stood in the dead garden with the gray sky above them and the old house behind them and the frost on the grass, and she thought about Elowyn standing at the east window and the long line of women who had carried this blood forward through time to here, to this moment, to this specific frost and this specific cold hand holding hers. It felt, despite everything, like arriving. The arbiters returned on the 29th night, and they brought 3 others. Cordelia was in the library when she heard them on the grounds. She heard them as she had not been able to 3 weeks ago, with a clarity that was not entirely her own senses, a sharpened awareness that she had come to understand as the trace becoming part of her, her perception and its interwoven into something new. She felt Valyrian change. That was the only way to describe it. She was standing in the library and across the house, in the entrance hall. Something shifted in the quality of his being. From the steady, controlled presence she had become attuned to over the past weeks to something older, something far colder, something that had governed a territory of its own for 2 centuries before choosing to practice restraint. She went to the door. "Stay," he said from the hall, though he could not see her. "No." A brief pause. "I should have expected that." She came to stand at the entrance hall's edge, behind him, and watched as the door opened before anyone knocked. 5 of them in the entrance. the 2 arbiters from before and 3 others whose age was apparent in the quality of their presence. Not old like Valyrian, but old enough. "The woman remains," the lead arbiter said. His gaze moved past Valyrian to Cordelia. "The 30 days have elapsed." "She is the estate's legal heir," Valyrian said. "She requires no reason beyond that. She has formed a connection." The arbiter's gaze was on Cordelia now, precise and impersonal. "The trace in her blood is active and permanent. You permitted this. She chose this. She does not have standing to choose this under our law. Your law." Valyrian's voice was quiet, perfectly quiet, in a way that contained no heat, and therefore contained everything. "Your law governs those who fall under your authority. This woman is mortal. She is a property owner under the law of this country. She has done nothing that falls within your jurisdiction. The trace is blood inheritance," Valyrian said. "Not a bond of my making. It passed through 7 generations of her family without my involvement. Its becoming active in her presence is a biological fact, not a covenant violation." The arbiter was silent for a moment. "You are parsing words, Valyrian. I am stating facts." Cordelia stepped forward, which she felt Valyrian register immediately. She felt the slight sharpening of his attention without him turning his head. "I'd like to speak," she said. The arbiters looked at her. Their regard was different from Valyrian's. It did not reach through her. It only assessed the surface. She met it steadily. "I understand that the council has law pertaining to blood bonds between your kind and mortals," she said. "I'm not in a blood bond. I have an inherited blood trace that is 7 generations old. I have also separately made a personal decision to remain in this house and in proximity to Lord Valyrian, which is my legal right in a property I own outright." She kept her voice level. "If the council wishes to act against Lord Valyrian for something I have decided, I would ask you to consider what the record of that action would look like to any reasonable observer." Silence. "She is not afraid of us," one of the 3 new arbiters said, not quite to the lead. Somewhat to no one in particular. There was something in his voice that was not irritation. "No," Valyrian said, "she is not." The lead arbiter looked between them. Cordelia felt the calculation happening. Whatever ancient political arithmetic governed these decisions, it's working through in real time. "There is precedent," the 3rd arbiter said slowly, "for mortal blood inheritance cases. The Valyrian ruling. 7-generation trace with no voluntary exchange. That was 300 years ago. The principle has not changed." Another silence. Longer this time. Cordelia held herself still and thought about her great-aunt's letter. "The arbiters will come. Let them." And then, "Be brave, my dear." "Not in the dramatic sense. Lord Valyrian," the lead arbiter said finally. "You will be observed. Any further development of the trace, any exchange, any covenant, will be treated as a full violation." "I understand the terms," Valyrian said. "The woman is not to be touched." A pause. Valyrian's stillness was absolute. "The woman," he said, very quietly, "has a name, and what she permits is her own determination." Cordelia watched the arbiter receive this and recalculate. "We will withdraw," he said at last, "for now." They left as they had come, through the door and into the dark, the fog closing around them without evidence of their passing. Cordelia exhaled. Valyrian turned to her. His face was fully controlled. But she could feel the thing beneath it, the relief and the residue of anger and something more complicated, that particular frequency she had been learning to read. "You argued council law at an arbiter delegation," he said. "I read ahead," she said. "You have a very well-stocked library." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not almost a smile. It was a smile, small, precise, real, the first one she had seen that was unmistakably complete. "You," he said softly, "are entirely remarkable." She felt the warmth of it, even from him, some warmth that was not temperature. She held it carefully. "They'll come back," she said. Yes. Will it be worse next time? It may be. Or precedent will hold and they will accept a solution they find less than ideal. He looked toward the door. The Valyrian case. That arbiter knew it. He raised it deliberately. Not all of the council is opposed to precedent-based resolution. We have allies then, in the most unlikely possible sense. It appears so. She stood beside him in the entrance hall, and outside the frost pressed its silence against the windows, and inside the lamps held their quiet light. And the house that had been cold and terrible on her first night felt, unremarkably and entirely, like home. Spring arrived without announcement, the way things did when one had enough years to stop expecting transitions to signal themselves. He stood at the library window in April and watched Cordelia in the garden. She had been there since morning. She had a habit of working outdoors when the weather permitted, dragging the battered writing desk out through the conservatory doors with the assistance of Pell, who had taken to the arrangement with a philosophical equanimity that Valyrian suspected masked a considerable private satisfaction. She was writing something. She often wrote now, filling the notebooks her great-aunt had left in the study with the concentrated attention of a person working toward an understanding. When he asked what she was writing, she said, "What I can feel. What I can remember. The memories that aren't mine." She was documenting the blood memory. Systematically, carefully, with the same precision she brought to everything. She had said she intended it as a record. He had understood then the kind of person she was completely. The council had not returned since October. The Valyrian precedent had held. He did not allow himself to assume this was permanent. Permanence was something he had learned not to assume, but it had held through winter, and he had spent winter above ground for the first time in 200 years, and the difference in him was not something he could have articulated, but that he was aware of, constantly, as one is aware of a wound finally healing. She was part of that, the central part. If he were being honest, the blood trace had become something both stranger and simpler than he had expected. It did not feel like a surveillance or an intrusion. It felt like a compass. He was always aware of the direction of her. He could always feel whether she was well. He had not understood, before, how much of his 2 centuries of sleep had been simply the absence of something to orient toward. He was not going to think too long about what that meant. He had learned over the past months that thinking too long about what things meant with Cordelia was a reliable path to standing in the garden at odd hours in April, watching her write, which was, he accepted this quietly, something he was about to do regardless. She heard him come out. She did not look up from her notebook immediately. She had learned over the winter that he appreciated not being immediately claimed by her attention when he arrived somewhere, that he had a way of arriving at his own pace and preferred to settle before the conversation began. She had also learned that he watched her when he thought she wasn't aware of it, with an expression she had seen him wear in no other context, unguarded, entirely present, belonging to a man who had not believed he would have anything like this again. She let him settle. She finished her sentence. "The East roses are coming back," she said without looking up. "I noticed. Pell says you planted them." She did look up now, tilting her head back to see him where he stood beside her with the April sun behind him. "The original ones, 2 centuries ago. I had optimistic periods." He looked at the roses, stiff canes with the first small leaves emerging, tentative but undeniably present. "They have survived without assistance. That seems to be a quality of things in this garden." She set down her pen. "I had another blood memory last night. This one was yours, I think, not Elowen's perspective. You were in the library, and it was winter and there was a snowfall through that window." She gestured toward the library window. "And you were simply sitting, watching it." He was quiet for a moment. 2 winters after she died, he said. "I spent a great deal of that winter watching snow. It didn't feel like grief in the memory. It felt like she searched for it, like learning to carry something that wasn't going to go away, learning the actual shape of it." "That is what it was," he said. She stood from the desk, brushing her hands on her coat. The garden around them was tentative with April, everything just barely returned. The grass coming green along the edges of the stone paths, the sky washed pale and high, the smell of wet earth and something beginning. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "You are always thinking about something." "I've been thinking about it specifically." She looked at him. "The council's prohibition is on a blood bond, a voluntary exchange, not on anything else. Not on." She stopped herself and tried again. "I don't want to cause more trouble for you. I want you to know that that is my primary concern. If what this is enough to keep the council at bay, then it is enough for me." He looked at her steadily. "But," he said. "I didn't say but. You were going to." She was. "But I want you to know that it is not, for me, defined by what the council permits or doesn't permit. What I feel about you is not contingent on formal structure. You were." Her voice steadied. "You were already something to me before the blood memory told me to feel it. I want you to know that I know the difference." He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached up and placed his hand against her face. The same deliberateness as every touch. The same clear, conscious choice, and looked at her with an expression that was not controlled, not careful, not architectural. It was simply him, 231 years of him looking at her. "I know," he said. "I have known for some time." The garden held them both in its quiet April. Somewhere over the east wall, a bird began. Pell could be heard, distantly, doing something practical with a wheelbarrow. Cordelia covered his hand with hers. She had come to Morn Hall in October carrying something she did not know the name of, a lineage, a blood memory, a debt of love that had traveled through 7 generations looking for the right place to land. She had not known then that the something waiting for her would be this specific and this real, this much itself, this much, despite everything, worth having. She knew now. The frost-killed garden had come back. The letters were still in the portrait frame, and Valyrian did not unwrite them, and she did not ask him to. Elian's memory lived in her blood like a handed-down warmth, familiar and separate, and she carried it forward the way women of her line had always carried the things they were given, without complaint, with full attention toward what came next. What came next was this: a cold hand against her face, and the smell of new earth, and the long, patient quiet of a house that had been waiting for exactly this arrival, and was, at last, at rest. End.